Hi! So I'm trying this new thing where I answer TikTok and Instagram spam comments on YouTube because, they're always so long. I'm not into the whole long comment threads. If you like it, there are buttons for that. So this is the TikTok of mine that is being commented on. The argument isn't that only Christians have morality, it's that the justification or the grounding for morality can only be found in the existence of God. And that's what I would argue. So you say that parents should raise their children to be good people because it makes society work better. Well, that's not always true, and to be honest, that entirely depends on your definition of good, your measure of good. And how do you measure that? Your measure will be different from Hitler's, I assume, I hope. And so in a world where atheism unravels, what you find is that you're ruled by whoever has the power, rather than truth. And our friend Demon Dragon 519 had words on the Instagram repost. Hope you're watching, Demon Dragon. This one's for you, bud. You say that the justification or grounding for morality is something that can only be found in the existence of God. Yet you yourself have no justification or grounding for saying this, as you do not have any proof that this supposed morality of yours is actually coming from a God and not just mere fallible humans posing as God and or using his name to enforce their subjective moral views unto others. Yep. Objective moral values and duties cannot originate from mere fallible human beings. God, a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, personal, powerful, moral being, is the only justification for objective standards of good. Without God, we're left with those mere fallible humans. And that would all be subjective and not necessarily applicable unless we were in agreement. The proof necessary for objective morality, then, is, at least in part, the evidence for the existence of God, which is the next thing that you criticize. You also do not have any evidence that this supposed God that you are getting your morality from even exists to begin with. All people recognize some moral code. We know that some things are right and good and some things are bad and evil. And every time we argue over what those things are, we are appealing to a standard that we expect the other person to know. We're appealing to a higher law, one that we seem to assume everyone is aware of, or everyone ought to obey. Otherwise, we wouldn't be arguing. We wouldn't be fighting for justice, for rights. We would be unbothered by the occurrences of evil. We assume that this higher law cannot be arbitrarily changed, or that it can't change depending on how a person feels about it at any given time. Nor does it depend on circumstances. Right and wrong imply a higher law, because this moral law transcends humanity. It transcends the natural world. This, it is argued, is God. Differences certainly exist in civil matters, but virtues like bravery and loyalty, and vices like greed and cowardice, these are universal. If man were responsible for that code, it would differ as much as every other thing that man is responsible for. Further, it's not simply a record of what mankind does. Rarely do people live up to their own moral code. So where do we get these oughts and ought nots? For when Gentiles who do not have the law by nature do the things in the law, These, although not having the law, are a law to themselves, who show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and between themselves their thoughts accusing or else excusing them. The moral law, or the conscience, comes from an ultimate moral lawgiver who is above man. Atheism provides no basis for morality, no hope, no purpose for life. If the logical outworking of a belief system fails to account for what we instinctively know, that belief system ought to be discarded. Without God, there's no objective basis for morality, and there's no purpose to life. There's no life. Yet all these things do exist. We know they exist. We know that there's purpose to life. We seek hope because we believe it's somewhere to be sought. Life exists. We're experiencing it now. We know that there is such a thing as justice and injustice, and we desire justice. This is the moral argument for God. And if a person is psychologically unsatisfied by it, that's not my issue. It is not my place to make a person believe in God. All I can do, all anyone can do, is present the reasonable, objective facts, the evidence that has convinced me and many others, and leave it to that person to then assess for themselves whether or not they want to follow the evidence or excuse themselves from it for whatever reason. It's usually personal and it's usually emotional. A person's dissatisfaction with the available evidence for a claim is unimpactful because the evidence remains whether you like it or whether you choose to believe in it and trust in it or not. Speaking of, cosmological argument, for one. If the current Big Bang cosmology is correct, and it's looking likely, the evidence is very good that it is, then the entire space-time universe exploded into being out of nothing. Therefore, the cause would have some familiar attributes. Spaceless because it created space, timeless because it created time, immaterial because it created matter, powerful because it created something from nothing, personal because a choice had to have been made to convert nothing to something. Impersonal forces don't make choices. These are the very same attributes of God, particularly the God of the Bible. The religious faith of materialism is violated by the discovery that the universe had a cause, that it had a beginning, under conditions in which the known laws of physics are not valid, and as a product of forces and circumstances that we can't know via science. When this happens, the religious atheist has lost control. The mind reacts by ignoring the implications. In science, this is known as refusing to speculate, or trivializing the origin of the world by calling it something like the Big Bang, as if the universe were a firecracker. The implication of the creation of the universe out of nothing is that there's a cause that is outside of the universe with the attributes previously mentioned. This isn't speculation, this is following the evidence where it leads. Alright, moving on. You even make a comparison to Hitler's measure of morality as if there is no way to tell the difference between an atheist's morality and Hitler's morality, which is odd considering your earlier statement that you weren't arguing that atheists couldn't be moral, but that the morals that they have can only be possible through the existence of God. Your statement very much implying that atheists are just as morally bankrupt as Hitler was. I didn't say there's no way to tell between the average atheist Joe and Hitler's morality, nor did I compare the average atheist Joe to Hitler as if they were one and the same. And I didn't say that atheists are as morally bankrupt as Hitler. I said that when atheism plays out, because there is no transcendent anchor point from which we can derive objective moral values and truths and duties that apply to all at all times, power then becomes the deciding factor. Power becomes the defining measure of what's good and right and acceptable. Like when Hitler rose to power, his worldview became the worldview. Atheism cannot justify objective moral values and duties and truths. In other words, if atheism is true, Hitler didn't actually do anything wrong. So even if I did make the comparison, why would you be upset? It would merely be a matter of opinion versus opinion concerning whether or not what he did was wrong. And your opinion and my opinion has no existential weight. You go on to say that my response is lacking for a couple reasons. You say that without an objective standard, in brackets God, there is no way to judge which individual's definition of good is the correct one. It's not that there's no way, it's that we'll replace truth with power. You then provide what you believe is such a reason. This assumes that God is the only objective standard by which to judge how correct someone's moral view is, or that it is the only objective standard that means anything. Now, both of these views are just quite simply false. That's your opinion. Not only are there other objective standards other than God by which to measure morality, the idea that the only objective standard which matters is God is wrong, simply because that is a subjective view by religion, with no objective standard of its own to back it up. God himself not included, because as I've mentioned, you've yet to prove that he is even real, let alone that fallible humans are not merely posing as him and or using his name to enforce their own subjective moral views. What other objective standards could there be? Well, for one, there's evolution. See, humans, being a social species, evolved to find certain actions unacceptable, such as murder, because it is bad for the species' survival as a whole. What's bad? How is it bad? Define bad. What deems it bad that human beings don't survive? Like, who cares if we don't survive? Why is it good? Why is human flourishing good? So what you're asking for is an objective standard by which I can prove that God is the only objective standard. Okay. The existence of a creator, the existence of God, is the only objective basis for morality. Objective means unbiased, unaffected by opinions and feelings. Evolution is literally not that. Evolution is not an objective standard by which we can draw objective moral truths. Evolution is a scientific theory on the origins and evolution of life. It's a study into the biological facts of life. It is not a basis for moral conviction. It's God that is by necessity that unchanging standard. Evolution and morality don't mix. Morality cannot be grounded in naturalistic evolution. Science describes the way the world is. It doesn't tell us how things ought to be. This is where evolutionary morality faces a widely recognized problem, namely that it can't give us an ought from an is. Quote, "One of the greatest problems of philosophy is the relationship between the realm of knowledge and the realm of values. Knowledge is what is, and values are what ought to be. I would say that all traditional philosophies up to and including communism have tried to derive the ought from the is. This is impossible. If it is true that there is no purpose in the universe, that man is a pure accident, you cannot derive an ought from an is. The problem stems from trying to deduce a moral rule or duty from scientific description. Darwinian evolution may be able to describe past behavior, but it can't tell me why I ought to be moral tomorrow or even in the next few minutes. It cannot prescribe future behavior. One question can never be answered by any evolutionary assessment of ethics. Why ought I be moral tomorrow? Any response to that question assumes an objective standard beyond the natural world. Everything could have evolved differently. The same, therefore, would be true of evolutionary morality. It's possible that evolution could have evolved in the complete opposite direction. Behaviors we praise could have been deeply immoral, and terrible vices could have been virtues. Philosopher Michael Ruse and biologist E.O. Wilson describe how things could have evolved differently. Suppose that, instead of evolving from savanna-dwelling primates, we had evolved in a very different way. If, like the termites, we needed to dwell in darkness, eat each other's faces, and cannibalize the dead, our epigenetic rules would be very different from what they are now. Our minds would be strongly prone to extol such acts as beautiful and moral, and we would find it morally disgusting to live in the open air, dispose of body waste, and bury the dead. Further, since evolution is a process of change, morality would then change. Frank Turek asks, if evolution is the source of morality, then what's to stop morals from evolving, changing, to the point that one day rape, theft, murder are considered moral? Trying to ground morality in a naturalistic framework is absurd. What is morally prohibited today could be morally obligatory tomorrow. Who's to say? Someone like Hitler, I suppose. Whoever has the power in the situation. And if evolutionary morality is the reality, who's to say this outworking is better or worse than any other potential outworking? It would only be morally different. For example, enslaving human beings may become moral. Slavery might function well in the perpetuation of the human species, in the struggle for survival. To avoid that conclusion, you'd have to smuggle God in. You know, a transcendent moral standard that evolution just does not provide. It cannot. Evolution is all about survival of species, meaning, according to evolution, moral beliefs are directed by fitness, not truth. We would come to hold moral beliefs based on survival advantage, not what corresponds to reality. Given this, some naturalists question the very existence of morality or of moral facts. Ethics, as we understand it, is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. It is without external grounding. Morality, or more strictly, our belief in morality, is merely an adaptation put in place to further our reproductive ends. Ethics is produced by evolution, but not justified by it. Because, like Macbeth's dagger, it serves a powerful purpose without existing in substance. The way our biology enforces its ends is by making us think that there is an objective higher code to which we are all subject. Because we think that ethics is objectively based, we are inclined to obey moral rules. Naturalistic evolution is a scam. Tricks you into thinking morality is real. The act of rape isn't really morally wrong. It's just that your genes have tricked you into thinking that it is. You've really got to unlearn that. Evolutionary naturalism doesn't explain the existence of morality. It attempts to explain why we think objective morality exists, when it actually doesn't. Basically, the evolutionary approach is not really an explanation for morality. It's not a basis for morality. It's a denial of morality that explains the illusion of morality. Charles Darwin wrote, "With me, the horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind, if there are any convictions in such a mind?" He was rightly skeptical. There'd be no reason for us to trust our moral convictions. If we hold moral beliefs because of survival, then we would have had those beliefs whether or not they were true. The theistic worldview makes sense of transcendent morality, avoids all the problems we've currently gone through. So don't be a silly goose. Humans have a great tendency to anthropomorphize animal behavior. You see it with annoying pet owners who treat their pets as if they are humans, which is not good for the pet. They interpret animal actions in accord with human thought. Animals aren't human. If we want to know why we have a conscience and a moral sense, the creator of all things provided us with a standard, a single authoritative yardstick of morality, the Bible, person of Jesus. And everyone falls short of that perfect moral standard. So God graciously made forgiveness of sin available through the sacrifice of the Son. He has shown you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you, but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God? If someone is murdered, then that is one less human that is capable of passing down his genetic information to the next generation. This is bad for our species, as it lowers our chances of survival. Thus, groups of humans who possess the trait of finding murder repulsive would survive longer and pass on their genetic information to the current generation, whereas those who didn't did not. So, two problems with all of that. That's not a moral motivation not to murder. And two, the one who murders gets to pass on his genetic information. He gets to survive and continue murdering and passing on his genes. You also said, this is why a lot of the big ticket moral issues such as murder, child rape, and thievery tend to mostly be universally agreed upon, at least to an extent. Whereas smaller moral issues not immediately necessary or relevant to human survival tend to differ by culture to culture. It also explains why these big-ticket moral issues are only mostly universally agreed upon, and not just universally agreed upon, which wouldn't make sense if God was the objective moral standard and wrote the exact same moral code unto each and every individual human. This observation of yours, that morality is only mostly universal and not just universal, isn't proof that morality isn't universally known. Just because a person knows right from wrong doesn't necessarily mean they will choose right. We all have free will, and we're all askew because of environmental, social, cultural experiences, not to mention sin. That's the controversial one. The moral standard would not differ by culture to culture at all. The mere fact that humans can argue on morality and have differing opinions on it speaks in stark contrast to the belief that God wrote all morality on the human heart. You can read a more in-depth explanation of this, how it works, in Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. It doesn't speak in stark contrast, because man has mind, will, and emotion, because the desires we have, because the behaviors we've formed are affected by external factors. Hence why we need redemption, why redemption leads to reform and not the other way around. And oh dear, Richard Dawkins is a physicist. He is not a historian, he is not a philosopher. He has no authority on matters of Christian theology, and his own worldview explains morality away. He only has his personal anti-theism, that which he wishes to pass on to generations. He even makes it very clear that even if Christianity were true, he would not become a Christian. Truth clearly does not matter to him then. So before you decide to base your moral thinking on such a man, consider his words here. The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive, many others are running for their lives, whimpering in fear, others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites, thousands of all kinds are dying of starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is, at bottom, no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. So not exactly the best person to take an objective moral standard from. And again, this framework does not provide a basis for objective morality. We talk about morality because we've got minds, because we experience injustice and desire justice instinctively. We have the ability to think and contemplate. We have the ability to create. We are intelligent. Where did that come from? Goo? Matter? Molecules? Monkey? Which gene gives me a conscience? Where is the trait that you speak of that causes a person to choose not to murder someone? You cannot explain the unseen, the unseeable, the immaterial by the seen. You cannot explain that which transcends nature by the natural. Right? My name is Christ Defender. I defend the Christian faith. I answer questions and criticisms concerning Christianity. If you like what I do and you would like to support me, there are 2 links in the description box. One to my Patreon and one to my merch. Bye.